If you've been listening to the news, you've probably heard that heavy rainfalls have left millions stranded across India and Bangladesh. Floods in eastern South Africa have displaced hundreds of people. The most severe drought in 40 years is pushing parents in the Horn of Africa to marry off their young daughters. And as we know, these extreme weather events often lead to an increase in violence against women and girls. Homes in Nigeria are not only suffering, but vanishing into the sea. South Asia has experienced some of its warmest days, with temperatures rising up to 47 degrees Celsius. And this has repercussions for the rest of the world. As record-breaking climate events continue to devastate global communities, it is becoming increasingly clear. There are no borders in a climate crisis. Bold action to tackle climate change is more urgent now than ever before to address the grave risks that we already face and to mitigate the effects of future ones. But no nation or organization can do this work alone. Each of us must do our part together. Thank you all for joining us today for our discussion on girls' education and climate resilience. And a special thank you to Natalie, Wanda, the 60 Million Girls team and partners, our wonderful coach Ndidi, international stakeholders, the Maxwell School, and professors for this opportunity. The outline of our presentation will take the following form. First, we will start off by discussing the methodology of our project, then move into sharing what we uncovered in our research, and lastly, address our policy recommendations for a way forward. Climate resilience building efforts have emerged as an essential strategy for countries around the globe to combat the effects of climate change. Let's get into the research to learn why. The Brookings Institution demonstrates that while emerging economies were responsible for only 21% of carbon emissions between 1850 to 2011, they faced 78% of the social cost of climate change. As we've seen just a moment ago, the geographic and demographic obstacles faced by rural areas place these communities at a greater risk of experiencing droughts, rising sea levels and rising temperatures, and an increasing incidence of other extreme weather events. When considering the sociological impacts of climate change, the gender dimensions are clear and cross-cutting. The combined pressure of interrupted education and the trend for households to resort to more traditional gendered roles in times of stress has exacerbated harmful norms against women and girls. Education in particular for young people has always been under threat, as 129 million girls are already out of school worldwide, with 97 million missing out on their secondary education. The added barrier to girls' education in a changing climate has meant that climate-related events are expected to prevent an additional 12.5 million girls from attending school each year until at least 2025. When we first began conducting our literature review on climate change in rural areas, it didn't take us long at all to find girls' education listed as an emerging solution. And this was really exciting for us, especially working under the mandate of 60 Million Girls, which is an organization that's wholeheartedly committed to this purpose. As such, our project and our purpose was to compile findings and policy lessons on the climate, gender, and education nexus, and to provide guidance on next steps for the organization. Our project has three overarching objectives listed here. So first, to explore how girls are more vulnerable to climate change. Second, to understand how girls are agents of change. And third, to develop gender-responsive policy recommendations. The method of our project consisted of key informant interviews where we led 24 incredible conversations with international actors and key stakeholders from India and Nigeria, as well as global literature reviews to extract key insights, which we're really excited to share with you all today.
Our research question is, how can girls' secondary education in rural areas in emerging economies contribute to strengthening resilience to climate change by 2030? To break this down, we first ask why girls? This is because climate change has disproportionate impact on girls. For example, girls face the greatest burden of unpaid care responsibilities that are intensified through climate change, and this discourages girls from accessing education. Second, why adolescence? Adolescence is the stage where poverty and inequity display their intergenerational effects. Educational disadvantage and gender discrimination often force adolescent girls into poverty, child marriage, and domestic violence. On the other hand, when adolescent girls are educated, they enact transformational social changes. Today, adolescent girls are leading climate action and awareness efforts. A recent analysis demonstrates that a majority of climate activists are young women. Third, why secondary education? Secondary education facilitates the critical exploration of ideas and cultivates agency. A woman who has completed secondary school is less likely to get married early and likely to have one fewer child over her lifetime than a woman who has only completed primary school. This project focuses on climate resilience. In contrast to adaptation, resilience is focused on building capacity. It is an overarching concept that includes adaptation and mitigation actions. Resilience is a more sustainable way of dealing with climate change. Our timeline for strengthening climate change resilience aligns with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals, a framework developed by the UN that strives to achieve gender equality, empowerment of all women, and ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. Last but not least, why emerging economies and rural areas? The countries that have contributed the least to climate change are the most at risk of its negative effects. These challenges are most felt by rural communities where climate change causes water scarcity, decline in access to and quality of food, and limited availability of natural resources. And that is why we spotlighted India and Nigeria early in this project as countries that are emblematic of these issues.
While climate change tends While climate change tends to hit the most vulnerable and least skilled people in emerging economies, girls' secondary education can be a powerful part of the solution to the problem. This argument is further supported by the ND Gain Country Index, which projects that with every additional year of schooling girls receive, their country's resilience to climate change increases in the range of 1.6 to 3.2 points. This essentially means that girls with high levels of schooling are more likely to reduce their country's vulnerability to climate disasters. A World Bank study has also estimated that if countries had invested more in girls' education between 1960 and 2003, nearly 1 billion people could have been saved from injury and droughts, and 60,000 deaths could have been averted from floods. Similarly, sexual and reproductive health education addressing puberty and menstrual health for girls is the most cost-effective way to limit the temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of century. A study has also found that reducing 34 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere would cost $220 billion if spent on family planning, compared to $1 trillion if spent on low-carbon technologies. Countries with higher proportions of women in the parliament are also more likely to ratify environmental treaties. However, at present, these problems and solutions are largely confined to the respective gender, education, and climate sectors and have failed to integrate on the whole. As can be seen from the Venn diagram, the intersection between gender and education largely excludes climate change considerations. Conversely, education and climate change dialogues on reducing vulnerability exclude the gendered implications. So, what evidence tells us is that to improve the effectiveness of climate change interventions, it is important that these issues are collectively considered.
As the earlier section projected the importance of realizing the nexus, now let us look at some of the benefits in details. Firstly, quality education equips girls with the knowledge and tools necessary to make informed decisions on family planning and determine how many children they'll bear, if at all. It has positive repercussions on mitigating challenges associated with population growth. We also saw school education as a catalyst in empowering girls through high-quality climate-conscious education. It helps them challenge stereotypes and become powerful change agents. Thus, the cultivation of climate leadership and environmentally conscious decision-making through education. As greener technologies are being adopted, if girls are educated with green skills, they participate and thrive in more climate-resilient economy upon graduation. This also counters their underrepresentation in STEM and STEM-based jobs in the economy. Which brings us to our third highlighted benefit, and that is schools can prepare girls to shape climate resilient communities and economies. Finally, the life-saving implications of an investment in girls' education are most pronounced for girls from low-resource and highly vulnerable regions. A Brookings Institute study comprising of 125 countries found that the death toll caused by extreme weather events could be 60% lower if 70% of women were able to achieve a secondary school education. And these have cascading effects as families, communities, and societies also realize these benefits. This seems so obvious, but why hasn't it been done? Presently, we observe that leaders in each of these subject areas are working independently to address girls' education and climate resilience. This leads to a disconnect across sectors and among key stakeholders, which leads to inefficiencies, disruptions to the flow of information, and imposes additional costs, impeding the advancement of these objectives. In addition, even the majority of societies and communities still do not see girls' education as a solution to climate change. On the contrary, families pull girls out of schools to address climate challenges that arise from climate shocks. Our findings from both India and Nigeria reveal that families prefer to send only their boys back to school after extreme weather events. The prevalence of harmful societal norms and practices has prevented girls from accessing and completing secondary school. We observed a heightened risk in the face of climate events with disruptions in health, safety, and security provisions, which in turn increase the risk of violence, exploitation, and the overall vulnerability of girls. To quote an example from a drought-prone state of Maharashtra in India, it was found that men marry 2 to 3 additional women to carry water from wells and back. The condition of these waterways is an alarming situation, reflecting the existing gender disparity and the sole responsibility of care work on women. In northern Nigeria, increased attacks, sexual harassment, and kidnapping of school-aged girls has meant that even when schools are reopened, parents are unwilling to re-enroll their daughters in school, withdrawing them from schools entirely. There is also gender disparity in accessing resources. In reference to climate events, we noted this disparity specifically under the disaster response mechanism, which is not gender responsive and lacks provisions of sanitary products and contraceptives. Our evidence shows that many regions in emerging economies have substandard infrastructure that is unable to withstand extreme weather events, which have determined impact on girls' education. Our stakeholder from an island district in the state of Assam in India said that even though flooding is a common phenomena, the government has made no provisions to construct climate-resilient schools. We also found that there isn't enough emphasis on climate-related education in schools. It is not mainstreamed across national curriculum frameworks. There's also a lack of teacher training on climate change and its interaction with gender that has resulted in gender gaps in learning, skills development, and pro-climate outcomes. Few stakeholders also pointed out how environment education or disaster response within the curriculum in certain parts of rural areas in India is treated just as a box-ticking exercise. As only less than 2% of the world's climate national strategies mention girls, there is an obvious lack of political will on the inclusion of girls in climate strategies. So what's the role of 60 million girls here? The organization has been playing a crucial role in helping girls acquire skills to improve their lives and their communities. This has been done with the help of their Canadian partners' work on the ground, supporting education-related outcomes. Since evidence projects inevitable high economic and social costs for emerging economies in the future due to climate change and indicates an urgent need to develop their ability to cope with risk, here 60 million girls and its implementing partners can play a crucial role in empowering young girls to realize these environmental outcomes. They have the opportunity to work on a combination of issues, which is fostering girls' climate participation and leadership, developing girls' green life skills, and promoting their reproductive rights. These empowered roles will benefit the communities they come from in efficiently navigating climate-related events and building climate resilience. Thus, the organization can realize its goal by ensuring greater retention of girls in schools and enhance climate-focused learning in a locally relevant context. To achieve this, though, they must take rigorous steps to critically analyze their existing practices and work, and also work in collaboration with associated sectors. The remainder of our presentation would detail these steps both for 60 million girls and its partners.
So our recommendations are segmented according to the key implementing actors. The first tranche of recommendations are to be implemented by 60 million girls. The first key recommendation asks 60 million girls to integrate climate considerations into their organizational practices and policies and improve their organizational capacity to advance climate action through girls' education. It is proposed that this recommendation is operationalized in 3 ways. The first way is through the development of a climate-focused education and operations policy. The policy will outline the organization's proposed approach to advancing climate action through girls' education and will reflect the spirit of all the proposed interventions. This will act as a regulatory framework to inform decision-making processes and guide the organization in alignment with these broader objectives. The second way is through integrating climate-related metrics and language into their funding applications and project review and proposal processes. This will ensure that future projects reflect the organization's renewed commitment to climate action. And this will also enable 60 Million Girls to evaluate the implications and significance of climate change on its projects and help ensure their efforts remain cognizant of these realities and are sustainable. The third way is to include climate-related considerations and language onto the 60 Million Girls website and communications materials. This will demonstrate to external stakeholders and all parties who engage with 60 Million Girls the importance of climate action and girls' education and the organization's commitment to addressing these critical issues. The second recommendation asks 60 Million Girls to foster international collaboration through multi-stakeholder dialogues and develop a central repository to facilitate knowledge sharing between international organizations and funders. As part of this, 60 Million Girls should consider organizing a biannual virtual roundtable session with diverse stakeholders working in the gender, education, and climate sector. These discussions should be informed by the perspectives of local actors and people with lived experiences in the regions that 60 Million Girls and its partners operate within. The key takeaways from these discussions and international best practices can be compiled and published and stored in a centralized repository. This information can then be used to inform organizational policies and programming. Given the breadth of their existing mandate, as well as their existing networks, we believe that 60 Million Girls is well placed to manage and collate this information. In its initial form, we contend that this can exist as a subdomain on the 60 Million Girls' existing website. But the hope is that the Knowledge Hub can extend beyond this and become an open-source, independent, centralized digital platform dedicated to accelerating cross-sectoral knowledge sharing, improving transparency, and advancing these central objectives, as well as preventing the duplication of research efforts.
The recommendation for the implementing partners of 60 Million Girls are focused at ensuring schools as robust centers of learning and fostering deeper engagement between the schools and community members. Our third recommendation pertains to development of green standards for schools adopted or constructed by 60 Million Girls partners. This would include developing climate-resilient school infrastructure to withstand climate shocks, incorporating energy conservation strategies such as low-carbon technology, and ensuring that the new schools are located in areas of low risk. Given that children spend a significant portion of their day at the school, provision of adequate clean drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene, that is WASH, must be ensured in the school premises. This would positively impact the health and dignity for girls given their menstrual hygiene needs. In addition, provision of safe transportation for girls in the form of girls-only buses or bicycles can be ensured to enable continued access to school post-extreme weather events. Our fourth recommendation centers around designing a climate and gender-focused supplementary curriculum which can be disseminated by Rachel Technology, which is a portable server developed by 60 Million Girls to hold the content. The modules embedded in Rachel can help impart knowledge of local climatic conditions to students through inculcating green life skills and skills for green transformation, such as collaborative thinking, communication, and so on. This will enable individual and collective climate action and aid in transformational decision-making processes. To ensure a wider dissemination of these learnings and practices outside the school, the curriculum must also be developed in local languages. To implement this, periodic teacher trainings on risks and management strategies must be conducted, which may include activity-based learnings, case studies, simulations, etc. Our fifth recommendation advocates schools to serve as community resource hubs. The idea is to enhance their engagement with the community members and build their trust in the education system. These could be realized through hosting demonstration sessions on flood or drought-resilient seeds through community gardens, imparting knowledge regarding recycling, water harvesting, and climate bulletin boards, and showing documentaries on girl-led climate action. Our next intervention leverages existing women groups and leadership structures in the communities, wherein the partners and local NGOs can collaborate via steering committees to sensitize the community on sustainable adaptation and mitigation strategies. These groups could include women self-help groups, youth groups, women farmers, and so on. To realize these recommendations, it is extremely important that the partners routinely engage with the local NGOs and governments, which is our seventh recommendation. This would ensure that the partners obtain timely approval from the government on curriculum changes and share the best practices on gender-focused climate learning that could be further scaled up by the government. Under government's discretion, schools can also be leveraged as a safe shelter for community members with adequate gender-responsive relief material in the aftermath of a disaster. Lastly, we advocate for partners to conduct environmental scans of the government policies on their national and international commitments on education, climate, and gender. These reports could be in the form of annual publications identifying strengths and areas for improvement and should be made available to the public. Hence, we envision that the proposed interventions for 60 million girls with coordinated action by its partners would ensure a minimum 12 years of school education for girls, which would empower the rural communities to lead climate action efforts. Indeed, it's time to change the narrative from instituting the change for the communities to instituting the change with the communities.
But how do we achieve a successful implementation of these shared objectives? To this end, we've also developed an implementation strategy that assesses the feasibility of each recommendation and provides an overview of the potential resource considerations, as well as the steps needed to realize these proposed actions and amendments. As part of this, we've developed a detailed logic model, which is included in the annexes and broadly summarized here. This is chiefly intended to provide a representation of the linkages between our proposed recommendations and the central policy objective. Our hope is that this can be used to help the key implementers establish a common understanding of the goals and indicators for success and determine areas where added support may be needed. We have the 60 Million Girls mascot, Miranda, to help walk us through this. The logic model specifically outlines the recommendations as part of the key activities that emerge from the existing resources, funds, and inputs currently available to 60 million girls. We also recognize that the implementation and success of this work may require additional resources. Our hope is that once these activities are implemented, the general outputs they produce, such as well-attended routine discussions between relevant actors in the education, climate, and gender spaces, and within the regions that 60 million girls operates within, will then lead to attitudinal and behavioral changes over the short, intermediate, and long term. At its core, these attitudinal changes reflect a greater appreciation and recognition of girls' education as an effective climate change strategy amongst the key actors and decision makers, which include teachers, school administrators, community members, and government actors, amongst others. And this will in turn lead to a behavioral change to retain girls in school for longer periods of time. A focus on these dimensions has the capacity to foster greater climate participation amongst girls and greater climate leadership, as well as develop their green life skills and promote their reproductive rights. In turn, this will improve the lives of girls in emerging economies and prepare them to lead their communities to effectively address and navigate climate events. Through this, communities will then improve their resilience to climate change, and in turn, so too will their countries. The strategy also includes a Gantt chart. We have envisioned an 8-year timescale to realize these recommendations that aligns with our research question. The dependencies between the recommendations, as well as the proposed sequencing of activities, is also depicted in this roadmap. This will help to maximize the adoption and efficacy of these interventions. For example, this relays that implementers should engage with key actors and conduct needs assessments prior to the development of a supplementary curriculum or green standards, and that these steps need to be enacted before a school can serve as a community resource hub. We've also outlined the key milestones that are intended to support the implementation process, and they begin with the approval of these recommendations. To this end, we would like to acknowledge that 60 Million Girls has not only expressed approval with the proposed recommendations, but they've already begun work to actualize this. To date, this includes efforts to communicate the linkage between climate change and girls' education to all their partners. This also includes efforts to restructure their current team to really focus on this issue. Finally, 60 Million Girls has also decided to use climate change resilience and girls' education as the overarching theme for their annual conference in November. We're so pleased to see the organization's commitment to this work and the promising efforts that have already been taken.
So what are the opportunities and risks stemming from these recommendations? We refrain from conducting a traditional cost-benefit analysis because it is ill-suited to capture the depth of issues at the scale of climate change, and it tends to overestimate the costs and underestimate the benefits of related policy decisions. We have instead conducted a risk-opportunity analysis. The opportunities are the following are some of the opportunities yielding from these recommendations. Our recommendations advance international commitments on gender, education, and climate. They save the organization time and resources, guide their actions, facilitate decision-making, and streamline internal processes. The recommendations also accelerate cross-sectoral knowledge sharing and improve transparency in work efforts. Our recommendations enable schools to obtain sustainable and gender-sensitive infrastructure. They enhance the knowledge and skills of students and their families to cope with disasters and extreme weather events, and enable communities adopt climate-friendly and gender-sensitive practices. There are underlying risks that transcend all of the proposed recommendations and can threaten the success of this work. The nature of the relationship between 60 Million Girls and their Canadian partners and their operations within emerging economies is of significant importance here. Efforts to promote gender equality, climate action, and the empowerment of women and girls must recognize the central role of race and colonialism in global affairs and respect the autonomy of non-Western nations and actors to the greatest degree possible. The constrained capacity of key implementing actors may undermine collective action efforts and impact the efficacy of these recommendations. The potential lack of support from local or state actors is an additional risk in implementing these recommendations. However, there are measures that could be taken to minimize those risks. Issues with feasibility or relevance of these recommendations have been preemptively explored in consultation with staff from 60 Million Girls. The broader risks associated with societal attitudes and power differentials are addressed through the ongoing collaboration, education, and awareness efforts built into these recommendations. The timeframes attached to the recommendations have also been adjusted to reflect learning outcomes and communication lags. Moreover, all the recommendations include a regular review process both by 60 Million Girls and their implementing partners to assess existing strengths and areas for improvement.
Each of us in this room today is the product or byproduct of the right to girls' education fully realized. So when we say that 12.5 million girls are expected to lose their education due to climate-related events, we should all feel some sense of urgency. All girls deserve to live on a planet where a flood or a drought does not mean the end of their ambitions for the future. To build this world, we need to first recognize the realities of the one that we live in. We need to break down the silos that exist to ensure that gender education and climate efforts are not compromised, to employ necessary resources to keep girls from dropping out of school, to address resource scarcity and the exploitation of women and girls, and to prevent the senseless loss of life, which, if left unchecked, will have devastating impacts on future generations. Speaking of future generations, we would like to leave you with this quote. It's a Native American proverb that says, "We don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." A heartwarming reminder of how, since time immemorial, Indigenous peoples have strived to protect and preserve the land. We hope that this will help each of us better understand that our work with 60 Million Girls this year is not just words. We're preparing for the future. We're working to make ourselves better for children so that they can have the tools to not just survive, but thrive on this planet. Thank you for listening. That concludes our presentation, and we now open the floor for questions.
Okay. Great job, folks. Great job. All right, let's start with questions from the judges.
Do you want me to start? Sorry, I think we surprised Andrew by telling him he had to ask a judge first.
Because Andrew's always really, it's difficult for him to come up with questions. It's
Okay. But they're
All
all
right.
impactful.
All right. So Leslie, you're first.
Okay, yes, I will go first. Good job, first of all. Very nice presentation, and it's nice to see all of this come together. So nice work. Okay, a couple questions, if I can see it, if I can make my arm long enough. One thing that you mention in the report is that you are thinking it would be helpful for 60 million girls to kind of transform itself a bit away from so much of a volunteer type of organization. And I was curious, you propose all these different recommendations. How doable do you think these recommendations are, given the current state of 60 million girls, if they didn't change anything about that volunteer component?
So I can answer that question. That was something we were hyper aware of when developing these recommendations. And at the core of our recommendations is viability and ensuring that it is feasible. So we met with 60 million girls a bunch of times. We actually brainstormed a lot of these recommendations with them. And that's why we've narrowed it down and preserved their existing staffing structure as those changes to transition away from a volunteer-based organization into a paid staffing model would dramatically be outside of our current timelines in this 8-year scale. And we recognize that they've been able to successfully complete so much work that we're actually quite surprised at the level of work that they've been able to do as a volunteer organization. And they feel prepared to also take on these actions. But with respect to the additional resources that were needed, we did kind of note that in changing their organizational processes and in shifting to recognizing the nexus between girls' education and climate change, that they would likely be eligible for alternative revenue streams and funding practices, and that they might also be able to attract additional volunteers that are more interested in climate issues, for example. So it could be mutually beneficial in that regard. Yeah.
Great, thanks. The other question I have is you do have a lot of recommendations in here, which is great because, if you can't do them all, then you can pick. And along those lines, in terms of picking, which do you think would be actually most impactful for climate resilience in this particular case? If you could pick just one.
Maybe I can take that. So if we were to prioritize the recommendation, we believe that it would be building the standards for schools, because while it is important that the girls are retained in the schools for continued education and then there is no dropout, it is also simultaneously important that a safe learning environment is provided to them. And unless these standards come up for schools in terms of green buildings wherein they are safe even in the aftermath of disasters, and if government agrees, these buildings could also be used as safe shelters for all the community members. And our most important recommendation is also the climate focused learning outcomes. So in the manner in which the partners can come up with a supplementary curriculum, and those learnings can also translate to the community members in the local languages, then that will actually contribute to building their resilience when the disaster strikes.
Thanks. Like Leslie, I'm gonna have to try and read my own handwriting, which is always a dubious exercise. Yeah, I know. It's like, the thing is funny. I'm trying to explain to my kids why they have to learn to write properly, right? And then they're like, "Well, you don't." So this was great. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, thematically, with this idea that resilience is the key term here, right? That's what education does. And so I have sort of a big picture question, which was sort of rendered obsolete by the fact that, as you mentioned at the end, they're already advancing on this, which is fantastic for you guys. I guess I wonder, what's so special about climate with respect to this? In the sense that education's like a Swiss Army knife, right? It generates resilience on anything. And I found myself, when I was reading through your briefing, if you substituted the word climate change for pandemics throughout the entire document, would the argument not just sort of follow of its own naturally, right? That is to say, climate change is a massive negative social shock, of which there are many kinds. There's climate, there's pandemics, there's war, there's religion, there's everything, right? So what's specific about climate? Like, why is that the central overarching theme we're trying to build resilience around, and not just simply, like, it seems we're taking a Swiss Army knife and trying to make it into a specific feature knife, if you know what I mean.
So we spoke about like resilience, like as compared to adaptation. So adaptation is like the way we adapt to things that are actually going on. Like whenever it's very hot, we try to put on shorts and like lighter clothes. So that's adaptation. As compared to adaptation, resilience would be I need those shorts and lighter clothes, but I also need to plant trees so that it will be a little colder. So we're imagining that girls' education will be a long-term investment on achieving climate resilience. So that's how we approach this.
That also,
Up to the mic.
yeah, that also brought to mind the idea that there are. Okay, sorry, everyone online. So I think that also brought to mind the idea that girls' education, I think, transcends like just the climate issue, right? Like it's a strategy that's effective for a multitude of problems, right? And the core focus of our policy challenge was to explore that connection with respect to climate change. And that aligns with the current goals, sustainable development goals and the agenda for sustainable development outlined by the UN, as well as like just it's an emerging topic area to recognize this nexus. But we know that girls' education and empowering the girl child altogether can have like just cascading tremendous benefits that are realized that can solve a myriad of problems. So I don't know if that addresses your problem.
So just to follow up on that, I guess where I got stuck was your very first recommendation, which was that 60 Million Girls orient its policy and operations around a climate lens. And I'm wondering, is that the dominant lens, or is it just one lens amongst many that it might orient its activities and operations around? And if it's a dominant one, why? Like what? And does climate somehow capture all possible social shocks, or are there trade-offs being made here where some things might be getting dropped because of that? Like, I wonder if that should be part of your risks and you didn't do cost benefit, but the risks and opportunities question.
Yeah, I think with the first recommendation, we said that it was amongst one of the lens that they should highlight, given how topical this issue is and how it could be beneficial for them to highlight the benefits of like exploring this nexus in particular. But it's one of many. So I think they can explore, they can definitely institute policies that also include other lenses, but the gender and climate lens is especially effective and it's especially relevant and topical at this time. So we think it would be an opportune moment for them to do that. And of course, that would also be broadly applicable, that same lens and the idea of like instituting a policy that has like a gendered lens, has a climate lens, can also lend as a best practice to like future policy development like efforts, right? Like you can just add on additional lens. Like these recommendations are meant to be living documents, right? So it's supposed to be reviewed and over time. So I hope that provides some insight.
That was a tough question, Andrew. I don't think my questions are that tough. I have two questions following your template. My first question is broader, I think. So I struggle with where the line is between the things you mentioned around gender norms and practices and local culture and values. And I struggle with where I sit and thinking that the world should operate in a certain way. So how do I navigate that line? Where is that line, and how do I make sure I don't overstep by imposing things that for me would be my norms and my values? So that's my first question. The second question goes to something specific in your brief. You talked a little bit about it, but I was so excited when I read it and yet shocked when you started talking about girls being kidnapped on their way to school. So for me, from where I sit, I mean, I've never even considered safety as an issue or as a barrier. So when you speak about, like you talked about the buses, right? But you spoke about bikes, which I thought was a great idea. I hadn't even considered it. And I remembered, certain global nonprofit organizations that were essentially, you would donate a donkey or you would donate a cow or a goat to a family. And so my mind went to, well, I could donate a bike to a girl somewhere. So I just wondered, so kind of a couple of things around the bike question. So how do you implement that? How does it affect 60 Million Girls mandate, which is like not about supplying bikes? Does it change their mandate? Does it change the partners that they would work with? And how would you execute that? How would you make sure that the girls kept the bikes and the bikes didn't end up with their brother going to deliver produce to the market? So first question was about values. How do I draw the line? And the second question was about the bikes. How do we do that?
So maybe I'll tackle that first question, and it brings to mind our second recommendation about, fostering cross-sectoral collaboration. And one thing that was really important to us was seeing how 60 Million Girls as an organization operating in the global north can decenter itself. And so to do that, we looked to best practices. And while there weren't any existing knowledge hubs for this issue, tackling the nexus of climate, gender, and education, we turned to the UN Women Disaster Resilience Knowledge Hub, which operates in kind of a similar way if you were to replace some variables. And what they were really successful in doing was in any roundtable discussions that they would have, each discussion would be led by a different community leader. So whether that be an Indigenous knowledge holder from the communities that they're operating in or a partner organization, to get these different perspectives that might be lost if they're just like contributing members of these roundtable discussions and not actually leading them, because I feel like some of these conferences, can take on a whole different shape if the individuals who are leading them come into it with like their own perspectives and seeing the world the way they see it. So I think that's my answer for the first one. Does anyone want to? Okay.
Thank you for your second question, Natalie. Very interesting because that is something we also found out in our stakeholder interviews. And this is a very pervasive scenario in the emerging economies where when there is no access, mode of access for girls to reach the schools, they eventually drop out, and also when there are no hostel facilities. So, and this particular finding was informed by one of the best practices in our Indian state of Bihar, where the state government, they actually did this bike or cycle program. And actually, the girls' school enrollment increased by 32%, and the gender gap was found to decline by 40%. So yes, I think that's where the role of 60 Million Girls arises, because right now they are invested in girl education in emerging economies, and they do work with the communities. But if they do invest slightly in these bike programs, then maybe they can convince the government to do it at a very larger level, and then we can actually have the girl enrollment at par with boys.
If I can give an example for the first part. So in India, child marriage is quite prevalent culturally in some of the areas, but in accordance to the government mandates, a girl cannot get married before the age of 18. So that is the kind of behavior change that the organization can advocate for with the communities in collaboration with the local partners. So I think when there is tradition and also government mandates, there should be some kind of collaboration on that. And cultural practices like child marriage is not something that we can accept just because it is a cultural practice. So that's where the role of advocates and community leaders, their role really comes into play. So that is something that should also be taken into consideration. I'm sure that would disappoint the communities, but that sort of a behavior change is also needed. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're coming over to the sponsor table. Is that right?
We are, and then we're going to go online. So if anybody online has any question, they can raise their hand or write the question in the chat.
Okay.
But for now, we're going to pass it over to the sponsor table.
Okay, Wanda, Roberta, or Coach Nadidi.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank this amazing team. You guys have been great. It's been such a pleasure working with you. The recommendations for us are concrete, are extremely helpful. There is no way within our foundation that we would have been able to put together such a report. It would probably taken us 3 years to do so. You've been great using your intelligence and your experience in giving us something that is very doable. And as you've mentioned, we've already started putting into practice. We're so excited at the foundation to be able to integrate the piece of climate resilience into what we do. I would have loved to have been up there to answer the questions with you from the jury. There's a couple of things. When we work with our partners, so we're based here in Canada, in Montreal, of course, we provide funding to our partners who are located in the developing countries. They are the ones working in the field. And the first thing, and we've always told this to any of our donors or partners, if you want a project to work, you have to get the community engagement. You can pour money into things, we can have all these great ideas, but if the community doesn't want it, it just doesn't work. So we talk about colonialization or, our perspective and trying to impose it. It doesn't work like that. There's certainly enough demand around the world for money that we can pick and choose those where the community is really involved. And that's what we've been doing. To the question of why climate change, I feel that investing in girls' education to me has always been a no-brainer. If there's money to be had, it should be invested in girls' education. You touched on just, some of the repercussions that come, positive repercussions that come to a community when you invest in girls. The latest research is just starting to come out on the impact that girls can have on climate change. And it's not just, one impact among many others, but it actually surpasses a lot of the technological changes that are trying to be made. And we know that in various countries and various communities, climate change impacts in different ways. And so it's really up to each community to decide for itself what can work best. So again, thank you so much for digging into this topic for us, for getting all those interviews with some really great partners and organizations. We feel it's extremely doable, what you've proposed to us. We have started implementing it. As I said, our team is extremely excited to participate in this. And we think it's a topic that should be upper mind, obviously, with everybody. So I'm going to leave a bit of time for Roberta to make a few comments. But again, thank you so much. We hope to be able to continue the conversation with you over time. And it's been a tremendous help. And thank you very much, Chris and Natalie, and this program, because you've provided us something of super great value. And Dee Dee, thank you so much, because we know that you've been a great supporter of the team and really been able to help them focus on the particulars. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just have a couple of comments. I'm really, really impressed with how you've pulled the concepts together and really provided such a strong rationale for that connection, that nexus, and also the idea of, breaking down the silos, which is so necessary. And as Wanda said, the steps are very actionable, and we're really excited to, move forward with them. And it's just such an important topic. So thank you for taking that on. Yeah, I don't have any questions at the moment. Thank you.
Anything, Nadidi?
Yes, I thank you so much. It's been a pleasure working with Wanda and just this fantastic organization you've built. So thank you for your wonderful support. I just wanted to add on to this first question, because I think that climate change is different from pandemics, and it's especially in these emerging and rural communities, because this is where the most vulnerable live and their ecosystem is altered by a climate event. And in our country, Nigeria, which is one of the countries they studied, it actually has fostered the insecurity. The drying up of the Lake Chad has forced these communities to move, and it's created tremendous disruption. And so we see it. And if it's not addressed and women are not recognized as champions and as leaders, and they don't take over some of these interventions, our communities will suffer, especially the rural communities. And that's why, for me, it's such a critical issue of our time, and probably the greatest issue that we're facing as humanity in these emerging markets. So I just want to put a plug for that, and I'm really proud of what the team has been able to achieve. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Online, do we have anything online?
We have no questions
Okay.
online for now, so we can proceed
Okay.
with the other questions in the room. I know Leslie had some pent-up questions, but she seems willing to wait.
A pent-up supply of questions.
Yeah, she has
There's
a long
pent-up
list.
demand out there, but pent-up supply is not usually an issue.
I think Daniel's got his hand up.
Okay. Dan Weinstock? And then I've got one.
Thanks. So tremendous presentation. I really learned a lot. That's really great. Maybe this is a way of reformulating, or maybe not reformulating, but a dimension that was already sort of in Andrew Potter's question earlier on. So there are a number of ways. So it's a very intriguing sort of causal connection, right? You invest more in the education of girls, and at the other end, you get these dramatic improvement in terms of climate change. And then in between, there's stuff that happens, right, that leads from the one to the other. And, there are a couple of stories that I could imagine that give a little bit more granularity to that middle bit, right? One is you teach girls anything, right? You just increase their literacy. You keep them in school longer. You prevent them from getting married too young. All sorts of good things happen. They're more inclined to take on positions of social and political responsibility because they've been educated and they haven't been ground down with having to have kids at 14. And perhaps because of the care roles that they have, they're more inclined perhaps to be attentive to climate change sort of matters, and the good things happen. But you could teach them 14th century French poetry, right? And it would have that impact, because it's just a matter of keeping the girls in school and getting them into that position. The other story is a story which says you really have to focus on climate change. You have to have climate change focused education, and in a way that's the more obvious sort of causal story. But then the question becomes, is there anything specific about educating girls in this way that wouldn't also be given rise to by educating boys? To a greater degree about the reality of climate change, right? Perhaps there are all kinds of shortfalls. Certainly it's the case, I think, in our country, that there are shortfalls in the education system generally about how much we teach our kids about climate change. So if you have climate change, so maybe the story is not so much about the specificity of girls, but the specificity of climate change focused education. It could be both, right? Why choose, in a way? But I wonder whether you have any evidence that suggests that that one or the other of these causal pathways is the one that's kind of dominant in generating these really dramatic results that you've so well illustrated.
Maybe I can start. So yes, there is a lot of evidence, and that was the most interesting part, because our challenge is focused on girls, but our recommendations pertains to boys as well. They are not excluded from this entire set of recommendations, but that is the most interesting part, that girl education offers such a powerful solution to this entire problem. Because when girls are educated, their learnings translate to their families, and they are better able to plan, decide, and cope up with the climate disasters. And as a very interesting finding we found that if we invest our funds in low carbon technology, that will cost more than in reducing the carbon footprint than if we spend that money in girl education. And the cost difference is 5 times lower in girl education. And also we found that women are more aware of the food needs of their families, so they translate to a better food security. when women are educated, the family and their children are more likely to have a sustained livelihoods. So our entire recommendation touches upon 4 types of resilience, which is the income resilience, the infrastructural resilience, the social resilience, and the climate resilience as well. So that is how we envisage the whole setup.
Okay, we're down to the last few minutes. Or any other comment on this?
Just that made me think of something that one of our stakeholders said that. So he gave us an example like hazards or climate change will continue to exist, but hazards plus vulnerability leads to a disaster. So how can we reduce that vulnerability element so that the hazards don't lead to a disaster is something that this project also focuses on. So that's what I wanted to add.
Okay, any other hands up? If not, I'm going to ask a question. Okay, John Stewart.
I have a very simple answer to the question, why climate change? There is nothing wrong with developing a narrowly focused solution and then, if it works, discovering that you can broaden it. The Swiss Army knife started as a folding pocket knife, which was a very useful thing to have. And when you found that that was useful, then you added things to it. There is nothing wrong with that. And that's where a lot of great solutions come from.
Okay, I've got an observation and then a question. My observation is, I'll go back 10 or 12 or 15 years, the evening when I first met Wanda, which was at a small fundraising event out on the West Island. I didn't know Wanda, I didn't know 60 Million Girls, and it took about 37 seconds before one was absolutely engaged once she started talking about how she just explained how girls' education was a no-brainer, right? But I don't think you talked about climate change. The discussion was about how girls' education was effectively the Swiss Army knife. Is that by improving girls' education in developing countries, you could get all kinds of good good outcomes and as a path to economic development. One of the things that I think was most impressive, quite apart from the vision, was that it was it is a group run by volunteers. It was a group run by volunteers, and it was a group that had a shockingly small administrative overhead, which was, I think, at a fundraising event, a big part of the pitch. So the idea that you should transform 60 Million Girls into a kind of a paid staff, I wonder what that does to how 60 Million Girls would operate. And I don't know whether you thought about that, whether it would change the nature of how it operates, whether it would change its success as a fundraiser. So that's my observation, which you can comment on or not as you like. The question, though, comes back to the Swiss Army knife and Andrew's comment. So I guess my question is for you or maybe for Wanda, which is, if we took recommendation 1 and we imposed a climate lens on what 60 Million Girls does, let's just imagine that we had done that for the past 15 years. And my question is, what would 60 Million Girls have done differently because it imposed that climate lens? Would there have been some projects that they didn't do because of the climate lens? Or would there have been some projects that they would have done, but they would have done differently because of the climate lens? So the real question is, what is that, if education really is the Swiss Army knife that kind of makes everything better, and I think that's actually pretty easy to believe, including resilience to climate change, then how binding would that constraint be if you now impose this climate lens? So I don't know who can best answer that. I'll just leave that out there.
I can perhaps answer part, but I don't want to take the stage away from you. I think that's a very good question, Chris, because I look back to the projects that we've done, and just the fact of having girls in school getting a quality education is the winner. That's the winning formula. The addition of providing more targeted information about climate change, I think that's like an extra scoop on top of it that would make a difference, because as the DD said, and I've seen it in visiting projects in Nicaragua and Guatemala recently, these people's communities are changing. They can't do what they've always done. So, it's great to have the education, the literacy, and you might have more ability to get the information you need, but to add it already to the curriculum in the schools, I think is a very, very positive step.
Yeah, much the same. We have a lot of the same. This is a value added, so they're not mutually exclusive, or it's not going to reduce the efficacy of their existing work at all. We only imagine that it will bolster and improve their existing efforts, because these are realities faced by the communities that can't be ignored, and they impact education. So they're in a bit of a symbiotic relationship, whereas attention to one would improve attention to the other, and it's only, as mentioned, like one lens that can be used. And this would be likely the inaugural policy for 60 million girls as well. So it could be used once again as a placemat for future policies and future work as well. I think you had another question just with respect to the
volunteer nature.
Yes, the structure of the organization. I do believe that Wanda is best placed to speak on this, but we did, in exploring our recommendations and in collaborating with 60 Million Girls, we realized some of the trade-offs between transitioning to a paid staff model, which would be those, like the downsides may be with respect to their fundraising, right? And their ability to communicate how little overhead they have and how much they've been able to do. But on the upside, there may be added capacity. And we found that those trade-offs, at this point, we don't need to make a decision on those trade-offs at this stage. It's up to 60 million girls, and they are able to actualize these current recommendations without having to make like really dramatic structural changes, like transitioning to a paid staffing model. So I think it would be interesting to see. I think we did discuss the idea of maybe a social enterprise sometime in the future, maybe a future policy lab, but yeah, nothing else at this time.
All right, thank you. Okay, thank you everybody. That brings session 1 to an end. So we are back here